From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan. I'm here with the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, Steve.
I hope you had a very good Memorial Day weekend.
Well, I always watch the ceremonies, and I spent some time with the Veterans for Peace, an organization I belong to, with World War II, Korean, Vietnam, Iraq War, Afghan veterans, and they are brilliantly devoted to waging peace, which is something that you don't hear much about on Memorial Day.
Sure, yes. I have to brag a little. My Memorial Day weekend was spent at my daughter Julia's college graduation from Oberlin College. And it was quite interesting because the legendary activist Marian Wright Edelman was the commencement speaker. And First Lady Michelle Obama received an honorary degree, and she also spoke. So it was kind of star-studded because it also marked the 50th anniversary of a commencement address given by Dr. Martin Luther King at Oberlin, which was entitled Remaining Awake During a Great Revolution. And I think a lot of what we try to do here on the show is to wake people up and call to account the powers that be. So that was my weekend.
Oberlin was a real pioneer, as you know, the Underground Railroad, the first college to admit minorities. It's also the fountainhead of the politically incorrect movement, which started out as a source of humor among Oberlin students, but then became a very conforming doctrine.
Yes, I've had some discussions with my daughter about that kind of thing. But Oberlin was not only on the cutting edge of the civil rights movement, but they were on the cutting edge of the abolitionist movement from the 1830s. And not only first to admit and give degrees to students of color, but also to women. So I'm very proud of her. It was a great school, and it was great to be there, actually in my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. But be that as may, let's get on with the show here. We have a great show for you today, and this one is a little different for us because it's sort of around a unifying theme. Usually we have guests on different subjects, and this unifying theme today is one of Ralph's favorite subjects and also one of your pet peeves, Ralph, the media. We're going to be talking about things like corporate media, censored stories, media reform, and later in the show we're going to be joined by Professor Victor Pickard, who is the author of America's Battle for Media Democracy, The Triumph of Corporate Libertarianism and the Future of Media Reform. But first, we have on the line a very prominent media critic, Mickey Huff. We've actually talked about his publication last year, Project Censored. Mr. Huff is the director of Project Censored, which is a book that's published each year by Seven Stories Press. It reports the year's top 25 independent news stories which corporate media have ignored, misrepresented, or censored. Mr. Huff is not only the director of Project Censored, but he is also on the board of directors for the Media Freedom Foundation. He is currently professor of social science and history at Diablo Valley College in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he is co-chair of the history department. Mr. Huff is also co-host with former Project Censored director, Dr. Peter Phillips, of the Project Censored Show. This is a program that airs weekly as part of the morning mix on Pacifica's KPFK Free Speech Radio in Berkeley, which is our sister station. We're out of KPFK, out of Los Angeles. And that show rebroadcasts on several stations, including noliesradio.org and the Progressive Radio Network out of New York City. Welcome, Mickey Huff.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be on with you. Glad to hear that Victor's on later in the program. He's fantastic. His new book is great.
Yeah, this is going to be a great program, not one you're going to hear very often by turning on the radio or TV set in the country. Let's start with Project Censored. Mickey, why don't you describe very briefly how Project Censored came about and how it enlisted students in documenting the censored stories every year in this wonderful book that Seven Stories Press puts out called Project Censored.
Well, Ralph, Project Censored was founded in 1976 at Sonoma State University by Dr. Carl Jensen, a former journalism man who taught communications there. Unfortunately, it's sad to report Carl passed away about a month ago. He was in his 80s. Carl had this vision that, really that students were this vehicle for media literacy and social change by teaching them how to be critical of the news media and the stories that they read. And the genesis for Project Censored literally was Watergate. And Carl, who fancied himself as pretty knowledgeable about the news media, he was taken aback, a few years later by the time Nixon had resigned, and said, well, it seems like, how did I miss these other stories in the so-called alternative press at the time, where these people were talking about various problems with the Nixon administration, and it wasn't until later that the story broke. And so that caused Carl Jensen to say, I wonder what else the alternative news media is reporting on long before the major papers or the network news, what we call the corporate news media now. And that was the genesis of the project, and he used his classes at Sonoma State University to teach students how to be media literate and critical of media, and they would survey hundreds of alternative news media publications and find stories that were factually accurate, that were deemed extremely significant for people in the country, and they were just ignored or not covered at all in the major newspapers or network news. And he began compiling a list of those stories every year, and he solicited a whole bunch of people to be judges, right? And over the years, those people were either included Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, Michael Parenti, many others. And eventually it turned into a book. And so by the time we get into 1993, Project Censored is a full-blown book, and Seven Stories starts publishing the book just thereafter. We've now taken that project. We're in our 39th year. We're on over 20 campuses around the U.S. We have hundreds of students a year helping us review stories, 50 professors. It's really taking off in a lot of ways with our radio show and our new documentary film. And we're really trying to help grow media literacy around the country to combat propaganda and censorship, which is as prevalent now as ever.
With all the talk about student apathy, this is a bright light of student engagement. And it goes on year after year, and the students are never the same again. When they turn on TV, they're more likely to say, why is this vast wasteland, that was a phrase used by an early Federal Communications Commissioner, Newton Minow, under the Kennedy administration, they're more likely to say, why is this vast wasteland allowed on our property? The people own the public airwaves, and the broadcast industry controls it and gets it free 24/7 and decides who gets on, who doesn't get on. Well, here's a Project Censored story for you, Mickey. A few weeks ago at the National Press Club, there was a full-day symposium called The Israel Lobby. Is it good for the United States? Is it good for Israel? And it had people from Israel and leading international law specialists. Many prominent people were there, and no one covered it, not even C-SPAN. This was only a few weeks after the same media that ignored this story covered wall-to-wall the AIPAC pro-Israel lobby convention in Washington, as well as the right-wing CPAC convention. So this one is an amazing blackout right at the press building. Can you imagine? In Washington, D.C. Mickey, can you give our listeners the names of some of these censored stories so they get an idea of the range and depth in this wonderful book, which I urge the listeners to get from Seven Stories Press, Project Censored?
Yeah, absolutely. Our last book was Censored 2015, Inspiring We the People. My co-editor and our associate director, Dr. Andy Lee Roth, has done numerous books of these with me over the past years, and we're working on the next one right now. Ralph, you wrote the foreword for our last book, and we're mighty gracious for your efforts there in framing the book. The year before that, Censored 2014, Fearless Speech in Fateful Times, with Sarah Van Gelder in the foreword. We've really been covering a lot of ground, and we aren't just covering negative stories that the corporate news media don't cover. We're also looking for stories that really are actual ones of hope and change, not the faux elixirs that are peddled by, the PR industry of our elections. But, a couple of the stories that we've been dealing with for the last several years, Ralph, are very on your radar, and that's one of them is the TPP. We've been covering the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement for the last several books, and it's now finally just something that we're seeing a tiny bit of in the news media, right? When Barack Obama went on David Letterman to say how great it was, or when we see him quip at Elizabeth Warren about how she doesn't know anything about it. I mean, and that's an interesting statement because most people don't know anything about it, and that's exactly the problem.
They can't even get a copy of the agreement and draft, which the corporate lobbies get regularly from the secret negotiations between 12 countries on the Pacific Rim. By the way, this is coming up for a vote, so folks, if you go to tradewatch.org, you can get action materials with clarity and precision that you can refocus on your senators and representatives. Give some other quick examples.
Sure. Sure, absolutely. In the last couple of years, we've covered stories about FBI dismissing murder plots against Occupy leaders, corporate news media ignoring the connection between extreme weather and global warming, a complete U.S. media hypocrisy on the Ukraine crisis, how corporate internet providers threaten net neutrality, the beef industry's feedlot feedback loop. We've covered stories on agribusiness trying to silence and discredit scientists who reveal that herbicides are major health threats. We actually had a couple years ago a big story on Iceland and including the commons in their constitution and protecting the media. So these are some of the, again, more positive stories. We had a story on restorative justice in troubled schools that really turned around the student populations there without punitive measures.
Over the years, the dark side of genetic engineering industry, Monsanto, you've covered. This is a real ignored mainstream media subject.
Oh, yeah. We've been covering Monsanto and genetically modified organisms for years. We've been, of course, covering Israeli and Palestinian issues for years. The absolutely skewed study and the example you brought up a few minutes ago at the press club, irony is alive and well there in Washington. Not covered, right? Not covered at all. And we actually have full chapter-length pieces in our books. Not only do we cover the top 25 stories, we review a couple hundred a year, and our judges winnow them down. But we cover deja vu in the book, so we go back and look at what's happened to previously covered stories. Do they languish in obscurity, or do the corporate media actually go and pick some of these stories up? And on occasion they do, and when they do, we laud that behavior and say, let's do a little more of that. We cover something called junk food news and news abuse. You mentioned the wasteland earlier, and in the 1980s, Carl Jensen called this wasteland of so-called news junk food news, and also called the advent of the 24/7 news cycle news inflation. There's more of it, and it seems to be worth less and less. We also, in our books every year, cover Media Democracy in Action, where we cover civil society organizations, groups really working to make a change. And then we have several topical chapters in each book each year that are really full-length academic articles that are exposés of various things, whether it's the transnational corporate class, Apple and the untold story of globalization, sixth mass extinction. We have full-length chapters on mining policies in Central and South America, rewriting apartheid and Nelson Mandela, law enforcement deaths and so-called justified homicides. I mean, it goes on and on. Our books are chock full of things that if we actually had a free press that was doing its job, people they could sit down and watch 24/7 actual news stories, and it would never be done. And if people then would be motivated to act on this information, my God, just think about the kind of vibrant democracy that we could have here. And I see that in the students every semester, Ralph, and every year. I see the students that people have this notion, no, well, the younger people don't care, or they're all glued to their screens, and they're all thumbing and texting, and you know, I mean, that might be true for some of these folks in college, but boy, when they get a fire lit under them and they start learning about how they're being lied to or misled, and they're given the opportunity to be in the driver's seat of their own life and their own mind, boy, do they light up. And as you illustrated earlier, they don't forget that.
Yeah, not only don't forget that, but you cover things that relate to their future. You've covered in the past the blackout on the truth on the student loan racket, for example.
Oh, yeah.
And you know, I bet you some of our listeners now are beginning to say to themselves, hey, this looks like Project Censored itself is an uncovered, blacked out story by the main media.
As a matter of fact, we are. We've never been reviewed in the New York Times. We've had a blurb in the LA Times, I think, once. We pretty much get blacked out. I mean, we're not even on Democracy Now!
Why not?
I don't know.
Why not? You've never been on Democracy Now?
No.
Oh, that has to be remedied. Have you been on 60 Minutes? Have you been on 60 Minutes?
No, never been on 60 Minutes.
Have you been on PBS's Charlie Rose?
Never.
Diane Rehm?
Nope.
The Terry Gross Show?
Nope.
On Point?
Nope.
How about Scott Simon?
Nope.
All these are PBS and radio shows. Well, it looks like you're Exhibit 1, Mickey. I mean, why don't you do a story? Why don't you do a story on the blackout of Project Censored and have your students go to work on it and interview some of these outlets and say, hey, what's going on here? You have Bill Kristol of the Weekly Standard on all the time. You have Paul Wolfowitz. You have Donald Rumsfeld. You have Elliot Abrams. You have Dick Cheney, all these warmongers. What about a refreshing breeze? You say that in 2013 you became part of the National Coalition Against Censorship. Can you explain that?
Yes, actually, I work with some people on the National Planning Committee for Banned Books Week. So Project Censored has been a supporter of Banned Books Week for some time, and we became part of the National Coalition Against Censorship, which is a broad coalition of 50-plus organizations that oppose censorship in all its guises, whether it's banned books, artworks, poetry, you name it. Project Censored is, I think, really part of a long-standing tradition of supporting the First Amendment. And that means supporting it for views and for people that you may not like or may not agree with. And I think that we fit really well in the National Coalition Against Censorship. And we have taken some unpopular views over the years about covering certain stories. And unfortunately, people sometimes will conflate our coverage of a particular issue or a story with our some tacit agreement with a particular conclusion on it, right? And that's unfortunate because what we're doing is we're just saying, look, there's a lot of stuff going on with issue X over here that hasn't been unearthed, that is not being looked at by the major media, the questions aren't being asked, things are being swept under the rug, right? For example, one of those issues was the events of 9/11 and the 9/11 Commission. Another one was the election of 2000 and 2004 and the issues of election fraud, right? Controversial issues to be sure, but the corporate news media certainly failed the coverage of some of these really important issues.
Be specific. What kind of retaliation or sharp criticism or accusations have you experienced over the years, and from whom? Who are the most vociferous people who are outraged at you putting on the table stories that have not been reported that are important for the American people to know?
Well, I mean, we've certainly been ignored probably more by the corporate news sources that we tend to criticize most. But I have to say that some of the sharpest criticism came a lot closer to home. Some of our judges over the years, people that just didn't agree with the fact that we wanted to cover certain stories, even if we were simply covering them as an expose, saying like, hey, it looks like there's some unanswered questions surrounding this, and this story seems to try to shine some light on it. So actually, some of our most vicious detractors or critics over the years have been people on the left or so-called progressives. Some have been in the media reform movement, and we've certainly been critical of some of their more lackluster performance vis-a-vis the FCC attempts. But nevertheless, we kind of think there's a lot of room here to have discourse and discussion, and it doesn't seem to make sense that the shots come from within the spaceship, if you follow what I'm saying.
Yeah. I commend you for going back and seeing what happened after you exposed a censored story. That's very important. We often don't do that. And that's true for some of the best stuff on 60 Minutes. They very rarely come back and see what happened, if anything, to see whether the system is so overwhelmingly suppressive that even if something is exposed, it can be put in the shadows once again. But I want to ask you, Mickey Huff, this question. Have you ever censored a story? In the entire history of Project Censored, has there been one too hot to handle for those of you who have run this program?
Well, that's a great question. And I would answer it like this, too hot to handle. What I would say is that there have been stories that have been very controversial, but they have not necessarily factually proven their assertions. So there's a fine line then between saying, okay, do we want to promote this story even though it doesn't appear to have all of the facts in order and it's looking like it's speculating that there might be something to look at here, which is an important part of the process of critical thinking.
Yeah.
But in the process of that, if we put a story like that forward, then our credibility comes into question because people will again conflate the notion that we're either saying that something is proven or we're agreeing with the speculation. And those two issues aren't necessarily true.
All right, let me give you an example. Self-interest, okay? Did you pick my presidential campaign for the Green Party in 2000 as a Project Censored story, or my independent campaign in 2004 as a Project Censored story?
Did we choose it as a story?
Yes.
Well, that's before I was associate director or director, so I actually have to go back and look.
Yeah. Well, you see, there's a hot one. I know a lot of your work and the students are all volunteers, I suppose, but you must get funding from someone for the barest of expenses. Who funds you?
Oh, that's a great question, Ralph, because right now we don't really get a lot of the grant money that we once got. We never got a ton. We got a little bit of money from Sonoma State University for staff and things through student service fees and things like this. But we're not at Sonoma State University anymore. We only really get money from donors, Ralph. We don't get big pocket donors even. We get $5 a monthers, 10 monthers. We just did a fund drive for our summer book cycle, and we took about 2 weeks to try to raise $15,000. You know, we're a shoestring outfit, and because we covered things like problems with the 9/11 Commission report and unanswered questions with 9/11, and because we covered the issues of election fraud, and we covered the big pharma problems with Gardasil and these things, you know, people started to call us conspiracy theorists.
Yeah,
and that's, the favorite trope of anti-intellectuals.
Exactly. Yeah, that's true. And by the way, I don't know many groups that has such a tremendous output, the sheer output of your Project Censored stories, which are really fascinating. I mean, reading the book Project Censored, published by Seven Story Press, is almost like taking a college course in censorious journalism. It also alerts you to say, whoa, I should know this as a consumer, just in what I buy medicines. I should know this as someone whose family has to breathe the air. So it's very useful information, very sprightly written. And I want to really commend you and all the others and the imagination of Dr. Carl Jensen, of course, and Mr. Phillips, and of course you, Mickey Huff. Let's bring Bernie Sanders in here. We have a legitimate progressive candidate just announced formally in Burlington, Vermont, with 5,000 cheering people. His candidacy for presidency of the United States. He has been reelected as a U.S. Senator 2 years ago, former mayor of Burlington. I read his statement. There was very little about the media. Candidates for office don't like to criticize the media. How do you propose people in this country who are really keen about reforming the media approaching Bernie Sanders, and what would you want to have him adopt as part of his platform?
Wow. Well, as far as media go, I mean, let's go back to like one of the most basic principles we have. You mentioned earlier that the media is supposedly the public airwaves going all the way back to the 1934 Telecommunications Act. And this is a principle going back even further in the idea of the commons, and that the public, the people, have a right to this collection or accumulation of human knowledge. You go and you look after World War II in Article 19, right, in the Declaration of Human Rights, and that people have, this is a right that people have to access information and have their views heard and to hear other people's views. You know, I guess this shouldn't sound radical given how long-standing these principles are, but I would really like to see one of these candidates stand up on those principles.
Okay, let's say you're meeting with Bernie Sanders. He's a pragmatic politician. He's got to be real specific, and he wants you to put in a paragraph in one of his forthcoming speeches about media reform, and you've got 300 words. Go.
Well, we've got to return the news media back to the people. It must be wrested from the hands of 6 corporations that operate for profit, and it must be overseen by public commissions or public committees, and it must be transparent. It should be publicly funded, and it is something that is vital for the lifeblood of our democracy going all the way back to Jefferson. So this shouldn't be a partisan issue. It should be, in fact, a very pro-democracy one, and both of the major parties, if they weren't so ensconced with the corporate monies, maybe would see that. But that's part of a bigger challenge that you know all about, Ralph, that we face.
Since we know we own the public airways and we give it away 24 hours a day on thousands of radio and TV stations, let me ask you this. What do you think of reverting back through an FCC regulation or a congressional bill, reverting back 2-3 hours a day for an audience network. And people would join this audience network. There'd be modest dues. They'd have studios, they'd have programmers, they'd have reporters regionally around the country and nationally. So they actually use their own property to cover and report and give voice to all the things. And most of the important things are in the shadows. Bring them out into the light for a vibrant democracy. Revert back 2 to 3 hours. What do you think of that?
I think that's a fantastic idea. And to be honest with you, as well, when I'm doing classes with Project Censored materials, and I have students researching stories, and they'll go backwards and research a story that's in one of the books, right? And then they'll give 20 or 30-minute presentations on the story. They go and research the history of the story, how it's been underreported and censored, why, what's a devil's advocate view.
Right.
And within a matter of a week or so, these students, and these are community college students, right? They put together a 25-minute presentation that would knock your socks off. I mean, it's news that I would watch on a nightly basis. These people put this stuff together in a matter of several hours of research. So the idea that with all the expertise and knowledge and stuff from the journalism schools we have in the world, that this isn't happening, it's testament to the structure of the system and the lack of political will to demand that it operates in the public interest.
Well, let's make sure that Bernie Sanders hears some of this, and as he goes around the country, what are you doing about media reform? Bernie Sanders is the question. And those of you who want to get more details on the Audience Network proposal, actually something we drafted over 20 years ago, and it was heard by a congressional hearing chaired by then Congressman Ed Markey, Democrat of Massachusetts. And he had a hearing, and half of the table were the broadcasters who didn't like it, and the other half was me, Phyllis Schlafly, like a left-right support. Yeah, we want some of the time on our property back so an audience network can program and break through all these taboos. So, listeners, if you want a summary of this audience network idea, just go to nader.org and ask for it, and we will try to send it to you right away by the mail, by the way. Listen, we're about concluding, and Mickey, I want to ask you a question. Some of the most censored subjects in America today are actual publications. They're specialized publications that challenge the status quo. They ask the impertinent questions, and they cover relatively taboo subjects. For example, almost 30 years ago, a publication called the Corporate Crime Reporter started getting published. And at that time, the media never dared use the word corporate crime. It was white-collar crime. It was only individual bank tellers. It wasn't the big banks themselves that were stealing and pillaging and wildly speculating with other people's money. And this publication now is almost 30 years old, and I don't think I've seen one article on it. And yet the media does profile new and existing publications all the time. Look at all the articles on the Weekly Standard. Look at all the articles on the National Review when it has a new editor. And how do you view in Project Censored doing coverage of censored, in effect, publications, if I can use those two terms together?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. We have a chapter in our book for the past several years now. We brought back this idea of media democracy in action. And we highlight in those chapters, we do highlight media, but we also highlight civil society organizations, many of which are organizations like the Corporate Crime Reporter that people just don't know about or they don't hear about. You know, what we've been covering for the past several years in that chapter is we've been highlighting people that have programs, for example, you know, like radio programs on Pacifica. You know, we have Davey D from Hard Knock Radio that does a fantastic show. And as far as civil society organizations, we've had the Bill of Rights Defense Committee in here, a group that most people don't know anything about. The Acme Coalition for Media Education, which is a fantastic media literacy outfit that we're working with to create a nationwide critical media literacy program.
Look at that. I mean, it's amazing. Steve, look what, from a few $1,000s and volunteer help by professors and their students. You see what I mean, folks? You see how a little effort can have a huge range and a huge impact and change the lives of a lot of these students when they become functioning adults. They're not going to run around saying you can't fight City Hall or, my, this, you see, you know, this newspaper is suppressing that. They know what to do.
Nah, they're going to say
Mickey,
I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore.
that away. Mickey, give the listeners your contact number slowly and repeat it twice.
Sure. People can visit our website at projectcensored.org. That's projectcensored.org. Our emails would just be Mickey, spelled like the mouse, Mickey@projectcensored.org, Peter@projectcensored.org, or Andy@projectcensored.org. And you can get information about our film, Project Censored the movie, Ending the Reign of Junk Food News, our weekly radio show that's on 25 stations around the U.S. We were very happy to have you on a couple of weeks ago, Ralph, for the Pacifica Fund Drive. And you can see the updated stories. We have all the stories that we're researching year-round, whether they get in the book or not. So people can nominate stories, people can volunteer to get involved, people can try to figure out, how do I bring Project Censored to my local college? How do we get classes there? How do we get professors and students involved? How do we get a screening involved? And of course, we're never chasing away people that want to help us financially, because we really don't get a lot of that attention. We don't get a lot of that support, because over the years, Ralph, we've angered people on the right and the left. And I think that has something to do with that we might be doing something right. I was a big fan of your Unstoppable book, and I think you hit it.
You are doing something right, and we thank you for this wonderful program, and I hope you get a lot of feedback from the listeners who have a lot of questions to ask you, and I'm sure you want this kind of interactivity. Thank you very much, Mickey Huff, for a wonderful program.
Thanks, Ralph, and have a great talk with Victor. Tell him I said hi.
We'll do so.
All best.
I want to thank Mickey Huff, the director of Project Censored, for joining us today. For more information on that, go to projectcensored.org. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
And you stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Stand up. Oh, step up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan along with Ralph, and we just spoke to Mickey Huff of Project Censored, and we're going to continue our conversation on media with one of Mickey's colleagues in the field, Professor Victor Pickard. Now, Victor Pickard is an assistant professor of communication at the Annenberg School for Communication. His research focuses on the history and political economy of media institutions, media activism, and the politics and normative foundations of media policy. He is also the author of America's Battle for Media Democracy, The Triumph of Corporate Libertarianism, and the Future of Media Reform. Welcome, Professor Pickard.
Thanks so much for having me on the show, Steve.
Here we go, Victor Pickard. I want to really get my audience steamed over the ownership that they have had since the 1920s of the public airwaves and the loss of control to corporate commercialism that has occurred increasingly since then. And you've written a definitive book on the early days of radio and how corporations took over in the 30s and 40s. You want to explain that?
Sure. Thank you, Ralph. I think we really first have to begin with the assumption that the media system we have today in the United States was not natural. It was not inevitable. It traces back to policy decisions, policy battles, really, that took place, especially in the 1940s, as my book tries to show. And I think if we go back to that moment, we can see how we ended up with a commercial media system that's dominated by a handful of corporations and that is only lightly regulated in terms of public interest protections. And among democratic countries, this is a fairly unique situation. So I'm trying to show the historical and the ideological roots for this American exceptionalism. And I think we need to begin with these policy battles in the 1940s.
And you remember, as you well know, that Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s, and he was quoted as saying that radio, the new radio stations, were such a sacred trust that there shouldn't be any advertising on them. And of course, now 90% of radio is either entertainment or advertising. And most people don't remember how even a right-winger, a Republican like Herbert Hoover, who later became president, saw the public airways as public property. And what we've seen in the battles in the 30s and 40s is a very weak opposition defending the public trust, but they got enough in the 1934 Federal Communications Act to say that radio and TV are a public trust. They have to give voice to the public interest, necessity, and convenience is the famous phrase. And all that now in the era of Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity, it seems to be out the window. And what I think the listeners may really want to learn from you, Victor, is how did this takeover occur and how can it be reversed so that radio and TV can voice what's going on in the country more effectively instead of just cowering under the rich revenues they get from their advertisers?
Yeah, and that's exactly what my book is about, to try to show us how did this happen and how could it possibly be undone. And really, as you noted, going back to the even early 30s, there was a battle over whether the public airwaves, and it's as true today as it was then. In fact, the rallying cry, "the air belongs to the people," was sort of the slogan of this 1940s media reform movement. And from the very beginning, people fought over how this media system should look like, how it should be designed, what its public interest obligations are, what are its social responsibilities. And they did put up a fight, even though I agree that, not to keep your listeners in suspense, they were not successful. But from the very beginning, they tried to say that actually this shouldn't be given over to a duopoly, really. At that time, we're talking about CBS and NBC, and that there should be meaningful public interest obligations. And as you noted, advertising was seen as this really terrible thing. The public had terms of derision for advertisements. They called them plug uglies, singing jingles. They were completely horrified when these weird commercials would come on the air interrupting their programs. So this was not seen as a natural state of affairs. It wasn't seen as the social contract that most people wanted. And this is what took place in the 40s, these battles. In fact, you had a progressive FCC at that time that really did try to create a more public interest-oriented system.
And what was the political settlement right after the Second World War was completed in 1945 that you write about in your book?
So the post-war settlement for American media was basically boiled down to several components. One was that commercial media should remain self-regulated, that they should be socially responsible, but this social responsibility should be defined by industry, not by the public, and that they should be protected by a negative First Amendment. And what we mean by negative is that it protects media owners' freedom from government intrusion instead of a positive freedom which protects communities, listeners, the public, freedom for or freedom to a diverse news media system. And I think this settlement, this social contract, is still very much in operation today. It's still defining the way that the expectations that we can have of the commercial media system. You see that around battles today, like around net neutrality. So it's still very relevant for our current times.
Well, then what is left of the key phrase in the 1934 Communications Act, which is still on the books, that the radio and TV stations have to observe a standard described as the public necessity, interest, and convenience? I think that was the phrase. What is left of it with the end of the Fairness Doctrine revoked under the Ronald Reagan administration and the end of the right of reply to a scurrilous attack on a candidate, say, in a political campaign? What is left of that, Victor Pickard?
There isn't much left. I mean, there are still nominal public interest obligations, but as you suggest, most of the main ones have been removed, especially during the Reagan administration in the late 80s, especially under FCC Chairman Mark Fowler, who famously referred to television as nothing more than toasters with pictures. But even what's interesting, even among liberals today, many people will say the public interest has just always been hopelessly vague. We never really knew what it meant. And that's very ahistorical. These histories show that every time the public and a progressive FCC, which we probably haven't seen since the 1940s, every time they've tried to define what the public interest means, it's been defeated, it's been pushed back, it's been red-baited by commercial media industries. But I think it's a very relevant category for today in our new digital age. Again, net neutrality is an example of arguably of a public interest protection. So it's something that we really should try to define and protect.
The Supreme Court in the Red Lions case, Victor Pickard, ruled that the audience, you, the listeners and the viewers of radio and TV, had a legal right. They had to be considered under the First Amendment assurances inherent in the Communications Act of 1934 and the First Amendment. Could you explain the Red Lion case and how that can be used, at least argumentatively, for listeners and viewers who are so excluded and blacked out and given biased, one-sided viewpoints on their property, like Rush Limbaugh's show, how they can argue the case that they have a right, a First Amendment right, to have a role at the table?
Yes, the 1969 Red Lion Supreme Court decision was a momentous moment in legal history. It was a unanimous decision, and it really is a high watermark for articulating, again, these positive freedoms. They said that it is the audience that is paramount, the rights of the audience, that we should be able to access a diverse news media system, not the rights of the news media owners that's so important here. And that's something that's been largely forgotten. It's dropped out of the discourse today. In fact, in these recent net neutrality debates, you had Verizon trying to say that net neutrality was an infringement on their First Amendment rights, that they essentially were the press and that their rights trumped the rights of the public, of local communities. And even though the DC Circuit Court sort of sidestepped that argument, I think it's a very dangerous argument, one that we're going to hear about more in the coming months and years ahead. So I think that's what we need to do. We need to reframe this debate and really underscore the fact that it is the audience rights that are paramount. For a democratic society, our rights should be more important than the rights of a handful of media corporations.
Victor Pickard, Professor Robert McChesney, he's one of your colleagues, and of course launched these gigantic media conventions for media reform. I mean gigantic. Some of them were thousands of people participated. He teaches at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He writes about your book that you shed crucial new light on the political debates that created the contemporary commercial media system in the United States. And by doing so, he, Victor Pickard, in his book, America's Battle for Media Democracy, quote, allows us to envision a different and better future, end quote. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I think he means, in full disclosure, Robert McChesney is a friend and co-author and mentor of mine. But what he's getting at there is that in order to change the media system, we need to know its history. We need to see that it didn't have to be this way and doesn't have to continue to be this way. And that really it is subject to public pressure. And I think that's what this history of 1940s media reform activism shows, that when the public engages with these policy debates, it can really have an impact on how they unfold. But we also have to be realistic that we can't simply shame media corporations into being good, that we need to create public alternatives, nonprofit alternatives to the commercial media system.
And explain that in more detail.
Sure. So to give you one example, I mean, I look at the 40s where they did things like break up NBC, which is beyond comprehension. It would be like Tom Wheeler today breaking up Comcast or Verizon. They tried to pass what was called the FCC Blue Book, which mandated very meaningful and strict public interest obligations on broadcasters to hold on to their licenses. But in the end, this wasn't enough. And I think you need to create, one alternative that did come out of the 1940s, of course, was Pacifica Radio. That's a shining alternative exemplar to the commercial system. And I think looking at internet, we need to think about municipal and community wireless internet networks. That's an actual alternative model to these duopolies and monopolies that we're usually reliant on. So these would be examples of things that are non-commercial, not just trying to create more competition, but really trying to create structural alternatives.
I take it you don't think that PBS, public radio, and public broadcasting are sufficient?
They're definitely not sufficient. I think that if we were to really build them up and fund them the way that most democratic societies do, then they potentially could serve as one of these alternative models. But in the United States, even at the best of times, we've kept them very impoverished. And unfortunately, they have not been able to live up to their mandate.
And of course, they're leaning more and more on corporate donations.
That's right. They call them enhanced underwriting, which, especially in PBS's case, was really just advertisements, commercials. I see very little difference between PBS and commercial television in many cases.
Like the News Hour every night on PBS, heavily sponsored by corporate money. I wonder if that's one reason why I haven't been on so many years. Anyway, Victor, what do you think of micro radio? The FCC finally is issuing hundreds of micro radio stations that have a range of 4 or 5 miles, but that's a lot of people in a big neighborhood. How do you think that's playing out?
I agree. That was a rare and important victory for the public interest. And one of my colleagues, Christina Dunbar Hester, has also recently come out with a book that looks at the history of low power FM. I think it's very important. And yet, even with that alternative, it's not living up to all the hopes and expectations. Various groups have been able to launch those kinds of stations. I do think that is an example of an alternative model that we need to see more of.
Just needs more resources at the neighborhood level, would you say?
Absolutely. And I think it all does go back to resources. And that's why in the conclusion of my book, I argue for media subsidies for these nonprofit alternatives. And when Americans hear media subsidy, they often drop into a fetal position. But it's something that most democratic countries do not find controversial. And it's something that ideally we'd see more of in this country.
Yeah, how about the gigantic corporate subsidy giving the profitable radio and TV stations around the country free use of our property? We're the landlords, they're the tenants. The FCC and the Congress have made sure that they pay not a cent for their license. You pay more for your auto license, listeners out there, than the biggest TV station in New York pays for its license from the FCC, which is zero. Before we close, Steve, do you have a question of Victor Pickard?
Your book is entitled America's Battle for Media Democracy, the Triumph of Corporate Libertarianism and the Future of Media Reform. That subtitle, that phrase, the Triumph of Corporate Libertarianism, if I'm looking at that title in a bookstore or online, define that for me, corporate libertarianism.
Yeah, that's a phrase that you don't see very often, but I think what it gets at is this argument, this ideological position that came out of the 1940s, that corporations are individuals, that their rights, again, their negative rights are more important than the rights of the public. And it's used to discredit any sort of government intervention to try to protect the public interest. And it's, if anything, a stronger logic today than it was in the 1940s. Again, I mean, with decisions like Citizens United and that corporations are people, I think that this is a very dangerous logic, and it's going to be hard to get any sort of progressive policy making on the books as long as this paradigm is in place, as long as corporations are able to use the First Amendment as a shield against any public interest regulation. It's going to be hard to advance a progressive agenda, but I think it is possible, especially if the public engages with media policy debates.
And it also seemed like net neutrality was a big victory for the people in this case. I imagine that's going to continue to be under attack. And what do you see for the future of net neutrality?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's going to be incessantly under attack. It's already under attack from Congress and in the courts. And really that came about because of the nearly 4 million people that wrote in the FCC. So I think it's a great case study of showing how the public can change a debate. But yet we shouldn't deceive ourselves. We really cannot declare victory. In many ways, net neutrality just prevented a bad situation from getting even worse. It doesn't roll back the power of these internet monopolies. It doesn't bridge the digital divide. It doesn't create these structural alternatives that I keep arguing that our democracy requires.
Professor Victor Pickard, we've been speaking with. His new book is called America's Battle for Media Democracy, the Triumph of Corporate Libertarianism and the Future of Media Reform. We have to have you on again in the future. We're just touching on this fascinating topic. I must admire the luck that the students have, that they have you as a professor to open their eyes, drop the self-censorship that goes on in this area, and generate independent thinking.
For anyone who's interested in learning more about this history or would like to contact me, I can be reached via Twitter at VWPickard. That's VWPICKARD. Also email VPICKARD at asc.upenn.edu. And finally, my website is victorpickard.com.
Thank you very much, Victor Pickard.
Thank you, Ralph. It's been an honor and pleasure to be on the show.
We've
That's
been talking with Victor Pickard, who is the author of Media Democracy, The Triumph of Corporate Libertarianism and the Future of Media Reform. We're going to take a short break, and we have enough time now to get to a few of your Facebook questions. Join us right after this.
The Ralph Nader Radio Hour is a weekly series where we get to discuss with Ralph Nader what's happening in Washington,
What's happening around the world, and most importantly, what's underneath it all.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I am Steve Scrovan along with Ralph. We have some time now. We're going to take some of your Facebook questions to close the show. And we're going to jump right in with a question from Nancy Hildebrand. And Nancy asks, and I know you're going to love this question, Ralph, because I know you've worked on these issues. She asks, how did it come about that Congress votes on their own salary and all their perks, including special health care? What can we do to change this? And when they're out playing golf and threatening to shut down the government, why can't we make their pay the first that gets cut if they can't come to an agreement?
Well, first of all, Congress appropriates all federal funds, so it's got to appropriate the funds for its salaries. It leads to a serious conflict of interest. We've fought pay grabs again and again, sometimes successfully. One way to change this is to insist that when they're not working in Congress, they don't get paid. So all these vacations, or what they call recess times, other than a discrete vacation time that they're entitled to, they should be docked. They're very sensitive, so a letter on their pay gets far more attention than a letter on the military-industrial complex. I think that's all I can say, and get more questions in. Go ahead.
This next question comes from, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, and I'm probably sure I won't. Al Waisray Cycle asks, a question posed in Canadian media lately has been, quote, is politics broken? I pose the same question to you, but in a global context.
Well, that question's been posed forever, going back to Aristotle. And I think what it means is that the political system, polis, is not representing the people. It represents very highly well-organized, usually commercial interests. And in that sense, it's broken. More recently, is politics broken as alluded to the gridlock, where Congress can't get anything done, regardless of what should be done or shouldn't be done, because it's polarized between Republican, Democrat, the filibuster, and other rules to keep it from earning its pay on behalf of the American people.
Very good. Thank you, Al, for that question. Karen Crichton writes, we need help here fighting off the privatization of our water. Would you consider coming to Oregon to help raise public awareness about this looming crisis?
Well, unlike corporations, I can't be in 2 or 3 places at once, so I'm going to have to demur on that. But I'm sure the presence of this nationwide group, Food and Water, that has people all over the country is right on top of this issue, which is one hot issue in Oregon. I can't imagine that privatization is going to work, or what I call corporatization of your public water systems. But you have to be alert and beat it back again.
Thank you, Karen, for that question. We're blowing right through here. This question comes from Tammy Letts, and she says, can you please comment on Barney Frank dismissing the importance of Glass-Steagall in his new book? He is claiming it would not have prevented the economic meltdown in 2008.
Well, I think it would have put a roadblock in. It worked for 70 years, preventing banks from, under the same roof, engaging in commercial banking and investment banking. Today, commercial banking means loaning out to businesses and homeowners, and investment banking, unfortunately, today means speculating with other people's money and raising serious risk, which, of course, led to the crash. But on behalf of Barney Frank, he might have meant that Glass-Steagall did not regulate multi-tiered derivative speculation, which also led to the crash. And when it was repealed in 2000, a few months later, Clinton and the Congress and the big banks made sure that derivatives, which were starting to emerge in a big way, would not be regulated.
I have a question here that was asked by a listener named Doug Fletcher, and it resonates with me because when I told you I was at Oberlin this weekend, the president of the college, one of his messages to his graduating students was, please vote. You have to vote. He was talking about the importance of voting. And our Facebook viewer here, Doug Fletcher, asks, do you still think voting does anything?
Sure, if it's well informed and it's focused on good candidates or develops a atmosphere where good candidates decide to run at the local, state, and national level. Without voting, you don't have democracy. Now, if half of the people don't vote, they've opted out of democracy. If the other half ditto ahead because their grandparents were Republicans or Democrats, they're not really functioning as voters. They're functioning as what we call hereditary rubber stamps. So what we want are people figuring out how do they become a skilled voter? How do they know how to choose? How do they know how to say no, how to say yes, how to demand binding none of the above on the ballot, which if it wins, cancels that election, brings new elections and new candidates. So people have an additional option of saying, I vote no, I don't have confidence in the candidates on the ballot.
Well, very good. I want to thank you for submitting your questions on Facebook, and I'm very pleased we got through a few of them this week. I also want to thank our guests today, Mickey Huff of Project Censored and Victor Pickard, author of America's Battle for Media Democracy, The Triumph of Corporate Libertarianism, and the Future of Media Reform. If you missed any part of our radio broadcast, you can catch up with us as a podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, RalphNaderRadioHour.com, where a lot of exciting things are happening thanks to Jimmy Lee Wirtz, or Nader.org. Please join us again next week. I'm Steve Scrovan. Talk to you next week, Ralph.
Thank you, Steve. Thank the listeners. And if you're doing this on podcast, ask your radio station in your neighborhood if they would carry this program. Spread the word.
From Pacifica, you've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Special thanks to John Richard, Matthew Marin.
Our graphic designer is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our editor is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our board operator is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
Oh, what the hell. Let's make him our producer.
Our producer is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
And thanks to our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
And most importantly, special thanks to Mr. Ralph Nader, www.nader.org.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, is written and performed by Kemp Harris.
If you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast and would like to listen to it as a broadcast,
call your local radio station and say, I want the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
He's Steve Scrovan.
I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman.
Until next time.